Friday morning, 49ers update. Fresh off the NFLPA grades leak. 49ers got a C- for the training staff and for the training room, which apparently in 2024 did not have enough hot tub space for the players' liking. Across the board elsewhere, the 49ers scored well, including ownership, head coach, general manager. A minus, A minus, A minus. Their defensive coordinator this past season, Robert Saleh, got an A. And, I think that there might be a player that his new team, the Tennessee Titans, can pick at number 4. It is the Ohio State linebacker, Sonny Styles, who absolutely has lit up the athletic testing at the NFL Combine. Styles reminds me a lot of Fred Warner, who they call the Predator, who has absolutely transformed the linebacker position with his height and his athleticism. Well, if you look at what Styles brings to the table, this is no joke. 6'5" height, it's the same as Calvin Johnson. 244 pounds, which makes him only 3 pounds lighter than Derrick Henry. A 43.5-inch vertical, which is the same as Nate Robinson's maximum vertical. That is the NBA player that was able to jump out of a gym. A 4.46 40 for Sonny Styles. That's the same as Bijan Robinson. And a 135-inch broad jump, which is the same as Julio Jones. So Robert Saleh, who was able to trade for Jermaine Johnson, an edge rusher that he coached with the New York Jets, he doesn't have to use his number 4 overall pick with the Tennessee Titans on an edge rusher anymore. Now you can use it on this linebacker. Now you can use it on Sonny Styles. That's just one possibility. But, it's just an interesting discussion point because I've been talking a lot about how defenses are hybridizing. The adaptability on that side of the ball is having to counter what Shanahan-like offenses are bringing. And linebackers have essentially turned into safeties. If you watch Sonny Styles run, it's like a receiver playing the linebacker position, except that he's over 240 pounds. A lot of these downsized linebackers who had gotten smaller so they could cover, some of them weighed as low as 210 pounds. The fact that you've got somebody here at 244, again, only 3 pounds lighter than Derrick Henry, but is running like a wide receiver, should be able to run with wide receivers, that shows you the evolving nature of the linebacker position. And if you don't have those types of guys out there, then it's going to be hard to keep up with these ultra adaptable and athletic offenses, which is why Fred Warner is a future Hall of Famer and a fixture of the 49ers defense, why they missed him so much when he got hurt last year. And, why Raheem Morris, if the 49ers don't get their hands on some of these excellent linebackers when it comes to athleticism, he might be better suited running one of these 5-1 defenses, penny fronts that we saw from Raheem Morris in Atlanta, which means that you're only really relying on one big-time linebacker instead of multiple bodies at that position, because it is hard to find an athletic skill set like the one that we saw on such great display in Indianapolis with Sonny Styles. One other piece of news, apparently Kayvon Thibodeaux is on the trade market. That is the Giants' defensive end entering a 5th-year option season where his salary is going to be about $13-14 million. We'll see just how much interest he commands. I will say that his production in terms of sacks and pressures has decreased in each of the past 2 seasons, and he did have a good year in run defense for the Giants this past season, which was something that was weaker for Kayvon Thibodeaux earlier on. But this is a former first-round pick. That's why he's on the option, who I think is a good player, not a transcendent one. The Giants would trade him away to a team that would be willing to extend him. You don't trade for somebody like this on a $13 or $14 million salary without thinking about an extension right after. So I don't think the 49ers would be candidates in this case, but it is another defensive end to filter onto the market. Now, speaking of the 49ers, I was on KMBR earlier this week with both of the Gregs talking about the 49ers plans this offseason. We had a good discussion that I haven't had a chance to share yet, so go ahead and enjoy.
Well, I'm interested to know the exact mechanism of the Brandon Aiyuk divorce moving forward. I don't know if John is going to share that, but it's interesting to me because He's due an option bonus at the start of the next season. So the start of the next regular season. That's $25 million. So you would think that the 49ers would want to part ways with him before then, but since he hasn't been involved in anything, they don't actually have to pay him. He finished the last season on the left squad list, so they could hold Brandon Aiyuk hostage until he actually shows up at the facility and forces some movement. I don't know if the 49ers, maybe they just treat it as a potential headache and they just release him before then, but if Aiyuk does work with San Francisco, they can theoretically trade him. But they would have to amend his contract, because I don't think any acquiring team would want to inherit a $25 million option bonus that triggers at the start of the regular season. So there's a lot of different ways that this can go as far as the exact mechanism of Brandon Ayuk's departure from the 49ers, and I would just love to get some hints from John Lynch as to which direction it might head. And then obviously would love to ask about Eddie Pinheiro and any potential contract talks there, because I think he was instrumental to the 49ers this past season. Going to be really important moving forward. If the 49ers do use a franchise tag this year, that's the only situation in which I could see it potentially fitting, because the franchise tag amount for receivers is $28 million, way too much for Jawan Jennings. For kickers, I think it's somewhere between $5 and $6 million, which would make a whole lot more sense, because I think that's where Eddie Pinheiro might land, around $5 million per year. And he was so valuable to the 49ers last year that I think they've got to get something done there.
So while we're on Aiyuk, say he is released and the 49ers do just want to avoid the headache. How does that give the team financial flexibility that they wouldn't have anticipated having a year ago at this time?
Well, it would be, the guarantees for this season were voided several months ago. That was, $27 million? So
yeah.
that the option bonus that we were talking about triggering at the start of the regular season, that had previously been guaranteed. So back before the guarantees for this season were voided, when Aiyuk signed his contract, essentially, it had been a foregone conclusion that the 49ers were locked into this season, into 2026. Now they're not. Now they can get out of it. We're now just waiting to see how exactly they do finalize getting out of it. But that's $27 million that the 49ers initially did not anticipate having this season. That's the simplest way to put it. Now, they view their salary cap in the long term. Unused space carries over from season to season. I think it's really important for fans looking at this from the outside to realize that the big crunch here has always been 2027. Like, looking forward, that's when a lot of these deals start to register massive cap hits, especially Brock Purdy's, which was signed last year. So everything that the 49ers are doing this year, everything that they did last year, everything even before that, had to have an eye out for 2027 to make sure that there was enough room there so they would carry over the room necessary to make it work from a salary cap perspective. That being said, last season, the 49ers obviously cut back on outside expenditures. They doubled down on their own guys, and now you can add in the $27 million freed up for Brandon Aiyuk to the pot for how they might think about this season, but they still obviously have to consider 2027 and beyond. So they're not going to exhaust every single dollar of salary cap space this year, because they still have to operate with the knowledge that the carryover is going to be necessary.
It wasn't too long ago that this team had the perfect Kyle Shanahan wide receiver room at X, Z, and F, with Brandon Aiyuk at X, at Deebo Samuel at Z. It could also moonlight in the offensive backfield, and then third and Jawan, the big-bodied slot at F, and now you're looking at them all being gone. Jawan, I think we think he's going to sign somewhere else. So the X wide receiver, and you and I have talked about that, especially when Aiyuk got hurt, who could play X? And Jawan Jennings did. I don't see Ricky. I know he reps at X, but to me he's more of a split end, a Z, and a guy can go in the slot and play F. Demarcus Robinson can play everywhere, but is he that good of a player? So as you look at, and what I hear, and just looking at the list, the wide receivers in the combine, there's a lot of good X wide receivers. Do you trust a rookie to come in and maybe be your starting X when you go to Melbourne to play the Rams? Obviously Mike Evans would be a guy, but he's older. Can you really get him away from Tampa Bay? Just what are your thoughts? Romeo Doubs, is he a pure X? What do they do with that important, Brandon Aiyuk X wide receiver position, either in the draft or in free agency, David, or both?
Well, it's interesting because I think in general, the wide receiver draft class is deep this year. In general, the free agent class is not particularly deep. So I think that if you just look at markets and then you look at the supply and demand that's going to happen as a result of those truths, you're going to have to overpay for receivers. And that's probably why Jawan Jennings will be gone. Now, I've heard differing things, and a lot of that's going to be, I think, sorted out this week at the Combine. All the agents are in one spot. The GMs are here, and they'll have conversations, and they'll start to figure out what projected contracts might look like. I know that Jennings wants over $20 million a year. I don't think the 49ers are willing to pay that. If he can come in at somewhere at $15 million or under, I think the 49ers could be all over that. So we'll see how that all ends up getting adjudicated. But just in general, because the wide receiver free agent class is not particularly juicy, I think there is a higher chance that somebody like Jawan Jennings does go over $20 million on that open market. You mentioned Mike Evans is super interesting because first off, Mike Evans deserves more respect, I think, than he's gotten over the course of his NFL career. He had 11 straight 1,000-yard seasons. Only he and Jerry Rice have done that in NFL history. So he was
But he did it to start his career. Fifi didn't have 1,000 his first year.
Career.
Start his career.
Yep, 1 through 11, seasons 1 through 11, he did it.
He's
the only one that hasn't been 1,000 was this past one.
Yeah, because he hurt.
And his snap counts have decreased over the course of the past 4 years because of injury. He's going to be 33. Now, I wonder, because he only took 300-something snaps last year and wasn't at 1,000 receiving yards, I wonder if his price might be similar to the Cooper Kupp price last year with the Seattle Seahawks. And that was 3 years, $45 million, $15 million a year. I think all of a sudden you look at that if you're the 49ers and you say that's something you can roll a dice on. I don't think that you want to pay Mike Evans over $20 million a year, given the fact that, availability has been the biggest issue for the 49ers, and that's been the biggest issue for him over the past couple seasons. But if you can get a veteran receiver like an Evans in at a Cooper Kupp rate for the Seattle Seahawks, I think 2 thumbs up, absolutely. Because I think, Romeo Doubs is going to go for more just because Romeo Doubs is younger. He's been more available. Yes, he'd fit perfectly, I think, but the 49ers obviously have to fight in something that's going to fit within their cost structure.
Talking to David Lombardi here on the Yuma guest line, kind enough to join us from Indianapolis out at the NFL Combine. So looking at Christian McCaffrey's year, he was a finalist for MVP. He finished second as Offensive Player of the Year, and he won Comeback Player of the Year. Statistically, he was wildly inefficient under those circumstances, as you detailed in the SF Standard. So looking at it on a broad scale, to you, what's the best way to assist McCaffrey's efficiency? Are you thinking add another pass-catching running back? Is it take a free agent wide receiver for which you might have to overpay because the market isn't as robust as some past years? Is it rework that interior offensive line so it's not quite so many yards right after contact where you're getting hit at the line? I mean, just looking at the broad scale of it, because I know it's a bunch of confounding factors, but how can the 49ers address in a vacuum the Christian McCaffrey efficiency issue?
Well, I think first and foremost, they need to do a better job spacing out the field. And that starts with your weapons in the pass game. And that was the biggest issue at the very end when they didn't have who they needed to have healthy. Even Ricky Pearsall was playing really banged up. And obviously George Kittle had suffered the Achilles tear. So you can do that by adding at receiver or tight end or even running back with somebody who can also catch the ball. And the big issue with Christian McCaffrey and all the carries and all the snaps that he's taken is that they just haven't felt confident taking him off the field because the potential receiving ability and the comfort in the quality of receiver with their backup running backs hasn't been there. The two of the worst 3 running backs in the league as far as yards per route run this past year were Brian Robinson Jr. and Jordan Mason. Jordan Mason, who they let go, they traded because they didn't have that great comfort with him as a receiver. They need somebody who can maybe even be on the field at the same time as Christian McCaffrey in the backfield for Kyle Shanahan to be able to get creative, who they can trust in the receiving game. So I know Greg and I have texted about this, but Kenneth Gainwell is scheduled to be a free agent. He was the number 2 in Pittsburgh last year, and he might be the best receiving back that it's going to be available. And I know they've tried with Isaac Grendo. I know that the comfort level isn't there. That's somebody who they had viewed when they drafted him as a dual purpose kind of guy. I think that if you want to make sure that this improvement is seen in 2026, you might have to dip into the veteran pool with somebody who has proven that they can do that. And Kenny Gainwell would be an option at running back. I think if you look at the tight end position, if they move on from Luke Farrell, if they weren't happy with what they got in 1 year, Charlie Kolar is a name to look at. He played with Brock Purdy at Iowa State. He might be the best blocking tight end who becomes available in free agency, and he's a big target at 6'6". Purdy obviously had some rapport with him in the pass game, but he would help the blocking game, which I don't think was good. You mentioned the interior line. Yeah, that could improve for the 49ers, obviously, but I just don't think they blocked well outside of the starting 5 offensive linemen the way that they used to on the perimeter. So any receiver you get, you got to make sure that this guy can block. You got to bring that level of play back up in the run game. And then tight end wise, when Kittle was on the field available last year, they still ranked in the top 10 in rushing efficiency. When George Kittle was on IR last year, they were down to number 26. So you've got to get better blocking at tight end. That's why somebody like Charlie Kolar is a player who I would look out for in free agency.
Yeah, that's a good call. Luke Farrell, to me, was a huge disappointment. I thought he could not only be an inline Y, but he could block like a third tackle. I just saw him fan out and block edge rushers as well as George does, and he just didn't do it. And part of the reason McCaffrey's yards per rush were down was the lack of explosive runs, and you get those when the wide receivers block, and they just didn't have it, and having Juwan Hurd for a chunk of games with the fractured ribs. So I want to zero in a little more on Gainwell, because I was talking about him at length yesterday, and then you sent me your column today, and you're making a case that I'm making, but you're doing with stats and numbers. I mean, Gainwell, to me, he's not McCaffrey. Bijan's really good. But as far as a running back, and I know he has some wide receiver in him when he was younger and in college, he's the most like a wide receiver playing running back in the NFL. And you give a master chess player, Kyle Shanahan, 2 running backs that can do that. Jerick McKinnon, remember him? He was the original McCaffrey here. He just kept getting hurt. But that's the kind of player that Kyle wants. But the one thing that does interest me, I'm looking at his last year. He was not targeted that much in Philadelphia. The most was 50 targets his rookie year, 33 catches. Last year, Pittsburgh targets him 85 times. He catches 73, but only for 486 yards, which is 6.7 yards per reception, which I think I want more from a running back there. Yet you rank all the yards per route run by NFL running backs, and Gainwell's number 6 overall at 1.44. Bijan's 1, McCaffrey's 2, Jahmyr Gibbs 3, Kenneth Walker the 3rd, and even Jalen Warren, his teammate in Pittsburgh, was 5th overall. So how does that translate that his yards per route run were so high, David, yet his yards per reception were merely 6.7?
Well, it means that whenever he did run a route, then Aaron Rodgers was fairly likely to target him. And Rodgers loved throwing underneath this past year with Pittsburgh. That offense was very, very focused on the underneath games. That's why you see his teammate Jalen Warren also there. But yards per route run will basically take the amount of times a receiver's going or a running back is going out on a pass pattern and factor that into the average. So it's going to punish somebody who runs a ton of routes but is rarely targeted. So what that shows you is that he was targeted quite a bit in that run game. And I also would argue that probably one of the reasons that you don't see the explosiveness there, yards per reception, is because the Steelers were so predictable with how often they did go to the running backs that defenses were often ready for it. That, Aaron Rodgers was going underneath so often that the defenses would be able to put a lid on it. I would think that in an offense that is a little bit more dynamic, that has the threat of going elsewhere to the receivers and to the tight ends, somebody like Kenneth Gainwell would perform better in terms of yards per reception, and that in turn would also help his yards per route run. But I mean, you look at the running backs who might be available, and the Jets today. I think there was one of the combine press conferences from the Jets came out that Breece Hall will get the franchise or the transition tag.
Yep.
So I mean, he'd obviously be on top of the list, and he's probably not going to be available. Kenneth Walker, I'm not sure if Kenneth Walker's a better receiving running back than Kenny Gainwell, even though he scored higher in yards per route run. And I think for the reasons that I just outlined, that the Seahawks were more dynamic offensively, so he had more room to work with. But, I mean, even if Kenneth Walker ends up being available coming off of a Super Bowl MVP season, that's somebody that could be $15 million a year or more, right? So
David, what
you go
do
down
you
the
think
list,
about
and I think
Rashad White? That we were kind of going down the list as well, and Rashad White was kind of the other one with Gainwell that we thought that's someone that was used as a frequent pass catcher in Tampa with all those guys they had there.
I think Rashad White and Gainwell, I was about to mention him, I think they both fall into the same bucket. I think they're both guys that you can get for about $5 million a year. And when you're already invested so heavily in Christian McCaffrey, that's probably a price that you would have to shoot for. But I just think it's a great idea and probably a mandatory idea to get one of these guys who can also line up in the slot, be a receiver, or at least go out for pass patterns, because it goes back to what you were saying. Kyle Shanahan needs his adaptable chess pieces. And you know what? If the receiver market is overheated, the way to efficiently be able to bring in good offensive help to space out the field is through a running back who can catch, because you don't have to pay him $20 million a year. You can maybe get one of these guys like White or Gainwell for about $5 million a season, and it just makes a whole lot more sense, because then you could turn around and sign some other pieces.
David, as you know, being in Naptown for the Combine, the report out today, but we already knew that Kirk Cousins will be released by the Atlanta Falcons. We know how much the Shanahans like him. Any way they can get him in the building for an affordable price to be the backup quarterback and maybe make Mac Jones somewhat expendable?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if Mac is traded, and I think the 49ers only would be willing to do that if they get a really premium return, as I think is very fair for them to ask. I mean, Mac was a top 10 QBR guy last year, and it's not like we're talking about the 49ers' lack of weapons right now. Mac was able to do that with a general lack of weapons. So if they're able to get a good return, who's next in what we call it the QB rehab program for the 49ers? Maybe it would be an older quarterback this time around. Maybe it could be somebody like Kirk Cousins coming in. He's obviously toward the very tail end of his career, in his 30s. I don't even know how old Kirk Cousins is now, but he's been around for a while now. And I think that he paired with Shanahan early in his career, and I think that it would be a good pairing late in his career if he's willing to do that. There's a high chance for any team that you're going to see action as a backup quarterback. It's well over 50% in any given season. And last year, Mac had to play 8 games for the 49ers. So they need somebody in there. This is why they're hesitant to trade Mac Jones. They need somebody in there who's going to be able to take some quality snaps and make some good throws. And I think that Kirk Cousins would be able to do that for the 49ers. And right now, though, it's Mac Jones in there, and I think it's going to take a considerable offer for the 49ers to move off of him.
Well, David, thanks for coming by with us. I know we kind of got the pre-John Lynch perspective of the 49ers, and obviously we'll learn a little bit more today, but definitely wanted to have you on before Papa left for a few days and continued on this lovely battle that we got going here. So appreciate your time, and always good catching up with you.
Yep, and Greg, I was going to text you as well, but obviously Margot and I praying for you, sending our best, and I know the big few days are coming up for you. We discussed it over at the Super Bowl on Radio Row. It was good to see you there, but hang in there, man. We love you, and hope everything here goes as well as it possibly can.
Thank you, my friend. Right back at you, to you and Margot. Love you more than ever. And we'll stay in touch, even though I won't be on the air for several days, weeks, months. Hopefully we'll make the start of the football season next year and the trip to Melbourne. We'll stay tight. Love you, David.